total disadvantage because I know Jezzel's already wowed you. And so just to introduce myself, my name is Whitiora. Just apologies from Tanya. There's a few tangi around Rai at the moment, so everyone's been plugging gaps and running around town. But just nice to have a chance to have a bit of a jam this afternoon. So, introduce me.
Thanks everybody for staying. I'm sure my pitch was amazing. I don't have chocolate, but we've got some good numbers and data for you. That's exciting.
Do you want to turn that one off?
Actually, we might use the hangout because we'll just bounce.
Okay.
Well, kia ora. So we've been working on a kind of like a post-COVID future skills strategy. So really trying to look ahead and trying to understand, well, where are the opportunities going to be in our local economy for Māori, and how do we as Māori start to build kind of a picture around where we want to be. So kind of the loose idea is we have a tradition of disaster and calamity, and one of those was our migration tradition. I'm looking at Alex here, one of our wakami. So we had a uruwao canoe, and so the first arrival of our people into the South Island from the Pacific was aboard the Waka Uruwao, and it was beset by storms and all those sort of dark clouds, heavy seas, and so our tupuna, Rākai Hautu, the navigator on the waka, used the karakia, which is a haia te awa, wāhia te awa, puti to a puti waho, which means sort of like cleaving the waves and trying to form a pathway forward. And that was really a kind of metaphor for what it felt like being in COVID. And particularly when you start to hear that sort of talk of that big gloomy recession, to go, well, Māori have been in those spaces where we've been in recessions. We know those patterns of being hit first, hardest and longest. The GFC took Māori 12 years to recover back to where we were after that. So we didn't want to be in that situation. So really trying to think about puti tua is how do we emerge from COVID stronger and better than we were before, rather than sort of turning back to the way things were, or inequity as usual. So this is our Ngāi Tāhu future skills strategy for the region. And just a bit of a combo, I suppose we sort of say we're sort of hui and dui, but really that, when you're looking at it, we're trying to think of, well, where do we want to be? Trying to understand that and kind of set our own course. But then also, you can't kind of keep it all up in the stars, that we need a waka to get us there. And that's what I'll talk a little bit about, head in the clouds and stars and where we're trying to navigate towards. And Jasmine will be awesome to actually assure you that we are going to do something concrete and build a waka, and they're going to be trying to load it up with people to get us there. So again, always that thing of vision, to go, just simple thing of why isn't Te Waipounamu the best place to be Māori? Everyone I know grew up with, most of our cousins probably live in the GC and would say actually it's better to be Māori in Australia than it is in Aotearoa, which is really a shame. But to go, well, why isn't it this place the best place to be Māori? That's who we want to be. And when we keep talking about equity, one of the things we've been doing is just actually going, well, when we talk about equity in our labour market, there would be an additional 6,000 Māori moving into high-skill, high-paid jobs for the future. So when we talk about equity, it can kind of sound like that sort of aspirational principle thing, whereas really we want to start to go, well, in order for us to achieve equity in the future, we have to start to set some hard targets. So one of that is in the labour market, 6,000 moving into high-skill, future-focused jobs, and an additional 400 rangatahi leaving our school system with NCA Level 3 on top of what we are already achieving. So when you start to talk about equity and hard numbers, it kind of gives us a real solid fix. So that's the kind of massive transformational shift that we would need. And coming back to Jasmine's relations, rangatiratanga is not equity, but equity is like a stepping stone on the journey towards rangatiratanga and self-determination. And that's where our people want to be, but equity can be measured. Just that whole thing of placemaking. to go that a bunch of Tahitians arrived here a wee while ago, encountered a whole bunch of mountain ranges and snow and all sorts of things. So our people, our ancestors adapted to the land, and then the land adapted to the people. So when we really start to think about, even in COVID, it's how do we kind of go through another process of placemaking to go, well, how do we not bounce back to the way it was, but think around, well, how do we adapt to that kind of new normal? This is just a sort of skills forecast and economic jobs, opportunities and losses. Quite after the quake, the other disaster, the COVID recession, there was a lot of talk around that, quite a deep and hard recession, and that hasn't emerged, so that's something that's really positive. So we're not kind of needing to drive a narrative around how do we survive the apocalypse. But what's really interesting is that sort of 2023, 2025, that we sort of start to have an uplift. Important to recognise though too, to go, well, we kind of have this historic pattern of Māori being last on and first off. So any time there is an economic boom, that we aren't the ones that are positioned to be benefiting from that. But when we have an economic speed bump, Māori are always positioned in those areas where we are most vulnerable. Half of our people are labouring low skill, low pay, high vulnerability jobs. And so really when we talked, I'm trying to think of which Uncle Tani you talked to, but a lot of our kaumātua, they've experienced multiple recessions before. Most of our marae, at some point our pa had, a bus services, a post office, all of these sorts of things, footpaths, in the 1980s, all of those things just shut down, but aunties that lost their job at the post office and haven't worked since. So there's stories of recession, and what they sort of say was, well, when they happened, nothing ever changed afterwards. So when we have recurring sessions, the actual economic status and vulnerability and opportunities don't impact those same communities. And I suppose the key point to make is that inequality doesn't impact everyone equally. It hits those that have the least hardest and sits there much longer. So when we're looking future of work type space, to go, well, if we keep doing what we're doing, then we see the same patterns repeat, but the costs get higher as our younger and browner and faster growing population gets bigger. So if our population, our rangatahi population, is doubling in size over the next 20 years, then those economic harms can be expected to double as well. And to go, well, how do we do something different? And if you think of even just the way we talk about COVID recovery is build back better, and already you're just starting to frame the conversation in the past. Ministry of Works, shovel-ready jobs, and need to push more Māori into areas where we are overrepresented and vulnerable to future change. So when we think about equity, it's kind of that pink bridge is what we kind of got to build. How do we start to look at new opportunities that are designed for equity and designed around the idea that Māori are capable and can be leaders, as opposed to Māori are good labourers, and this is where we need to sit. And that's not dissing our people that are in those industries, but at a kind of a bigger picture, to go, if we keep shoveling and channeling more Māori to where we are vulnerable, then we are just making our future problems worse, as opposed to actually building something equitable, that better future. So quickly zip through these, but just I suppose that's kind of our equivalent of that really wicked thing the spin-off did around the K-shaped recovery. And so that we can see that that white line is that high growth and high skill jobs. The mustard line, orange line, is that higher growth in low skill jobs, and then you've sort of got the two middle ones running through there. And so basically, again, in that recovery, what we're seeing is an acceleration of transition into what we probably call those sort of future skilled, future focused industries. So there's huge opportunities that are coming, but we have a gap in time because we have a couple of years before it really starts to kick in. But our big gap is actually a massive gap in skill. That how do we support those that are in those lower skill, lower pay, higher vulnerability jobs into those higher paying jobs of the future, and it's a significant challenge, but we've got a bit of time. So when we talked about equity before, trying to think about, well, how do we have an equitable recovery that's more than just words? And really, again, starting to think about that there are going to be significant opportunities in our takiwā for our rangatahi coming through. But really trying to look at, well, what happens if we screen for jobs that pay over $50,000, which isn't a huge amount, but is a wage that can support a whānau. Opportunities that are in growth mode, not decline. Opportunities that offer progression, promotion, so you can move your way up. And then jobs that also are insulated to changes from the future of work. So when we think about all of this stuff around shovel ready and that big push and pushing more Māori into these areas, these are what we would call kind of future ready. That this would be our recipe book if we want an equitable future that will build Māori immunity to future recessions and the future of work. And so you can kind of see that rather than looking at primary and construction, you've got sort of commerce, health, STEM, education, and tech. And these are the areas where Māori are critically underrepresented, but these are also the areas that offer us the greatest opportunities in terms of pay, in terms of prospects, and in terms of building immunity to future change. And so that's kind of basically our playbook or our strategy for the future, in the sense of how do we start to build Māori pathways into these areas where our leadership and potential can flourish, but also that we are totally trying to build immunity to the next economic shock, the next recession that comes around the corner. And you can kind of see from the occupations, the technical or specialist skills, and we're doing a lot of work with Whitiora around how do we build workable tools. I say that it's not me, they're all still doing it, but around transferable skills. So how do we build that resilience and the ability to adapt to future change? Just looking at it, I will release this probably in a couple of weeks, but really starting to think around, even just with industry, just picking one thing, but the simple thing of having the degree is like a ticket to entry. It is a cultural attribute that is in most of our organisations and employers. And when you have inequity, having a degree as your ticket to entry into a good job reinforces inequalities and inequities that impact Māori. So when we start to think around that, how do we start to move from a qualification-based approach to a skills-based approach? And someone like myself, I got my degree when I was 22, I'm 43, and I've learned a lot since graduation. And so that sort of fallacy, the silly idea that somehow a ticket captures a moment in time can fairly represent someone's skills. But to know that when we have that kind of culture and behaviour with employers, it actually compounds the problems and closes the door for heaps of really highly skilled and capable relations that can't get into good jobs, that can't get promoted because of that lack of a qualification, because of historical inequities. So there are just changes that we're going to need to be making if we want to actually start to tackle inequity in our region and realise the potential of our younger, faster growing Māori and Pacifica population. Ka nui te pahupahu I konei. I think that's enough hui, and as I said, setting some kind of general direction, but I suppose the big one is we don't want to go back to normal. We're at a moment where we've got sort of Māori unemployment that's 3 to 4 times that of Pākehā in Christchurch, and we don't want to go back to being 2 to 3 times more Māori unemployment. We want equity. So how do we start to get there and start to understand, where those opportunities will be, which there are plenty of, but how do we build those pathways and the waka to get us there?
So, that's a massive think tank. So for the past year, while we were stuck in lockdown, there was a group of very smart people that got together on Zoom and said, what are we going to do? We know that our whānau are going to be the most impacted over COVID. What are we going to do about it? We've got some resource here, we've got some good ideas, we've got some smarts. How are we going to counteract this? And I suppose this is how Whitiora was born. So Whitiora has been in the works for a year now, and we are just trying to come to fruition.
Excuse me, are we able to close that curtain because we can't see the screen if you're going to do more slides?
You keep going. I'll Kate's checking it out.
Not very helpful, is it? While we're looking for that, so Whitiora was born out of an idea to help whānau. How do we minimise impact? So we're very lucky that in the background, Edu's team at Tokona Te Raki have been compiling a lot of good data for us. They've come up with some great figures that show the need for some new innovative thinking and doing. So what we know about Whitiora is that we now have 2 staff and we are working to launch Whitiora as a Maori Skills Centre. When I say Maori, it means everybody, but with a focus to deliver in a culturally responsive way. So we know for us that what works for Maori works for everybody. We know our people well, we know our pā people well, and we know what kind of environments they need to be able to thrive. So Whitiora is the baby of that. We'll be launching very, very soon, and we're here just to give you a little snippet and a prelim on what we have been delivering. So we've got 3 work streams. 3 work streams here. So Whitiora is based in the middle, and we'll be the hub that holds and then connects out to industry, training, upskilling, and social enterprise. So what we're trying to achieve is to have the right team around us that know our people, know our communities, and can go out and network and connect the dots together. So we want to work with anyone that wants to work with us, and we'll be taking a strength-based approach, and we'll be working to either upskill and train so that those ones that are looking for a step up in their career, or they're looking for work and want to get into a specific industry, we'll be supporting them, as well as we know that whānau need income right now, so we'll be getting those jobs that are easy to reach. And then further on down the line, we'll be looking at social enterprise and how they can build their own wee empires and be self-determining. So that's our beautiful little pathway here. So these are 3 work streams that we're working on. Our whole goal is to reach for the stars, and we've got to blaze these trails to get there. So a core part of the role for Whitiora will be engaging industry, and that will mean some deep conversations about how they might evolve to meet the needs of our whānau as well. So we know that some of our whānau don't necessarily fit into the boxes as for anyone. So it's how industry might curve and reshape to meet the needs of our people. When I say our people, I mean everybody. And that includes, they might start in a entry-level position. They'll see some talent in there, they might grow up. How do we stairway them up into those better positions, higher ranks, better pays, so that they are not first off the chopping block, as we've seen so far. And the existing jobs is surviving the present. They need an income now. MSD is not always the first place that people want to go into, so if they can help themselves first, we want to be there to support them to do that. Right, so the lab, which is what Edu's team is called, Tokona Te Raki, they've been working hard in the background to to build some industry relationships for us, get all the data and the evidence to back it up on why we need to be here. And we will constantly be doing evaluations to prove that this model is working. So while we're not up and running yet, we've already got the evidence to say we don't work, because we can't play it. Centre, whānau. So Māori hold their values kind of really steadfast. We know that we're really good at whānau. We know that we're really good at manakitanga. So how do we incorporate that so that whānau feel safe to come into us and then we can go and take them out into the world? So we will be doing these pathways, but they will look a little bit different to how they're usually done. So we'll do it in a way that is conducive to each individual or whānau. Industry partnerships, like I said, we'll be building those and ensuring that we're placing our whānau into safe positions with safe employers, and we'll keep building on that as we go. So rangatiratanga, that's that social enterprise that I was talking about earlier, which is what we're reaching for. We want whānau to be able to determine their own destinies and not require as much support as they might need now. So any new businesses and things like that, any way that they can create their own income streams is what we are hoping that they'll be getting into. And invitations, so we're looking for anyone that wants to come partner up with us, that likes our vision, adheres with our values as well, and we're happy to talk to them. Thank you for listening. I think I'm out of time. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I do. I was wondering whereabouts is the funding coming from that, and if it has anything to do with the wellbeing budget that also funds the Maori cadetship programs, and if potentially the avenues for talking to you about programs for young Maori youth would be the same avenues or not?
Totally. So we have a few different multiple funding streams and partners. Mostly it's government agencies that come in through at the moment. But we're open, as I say, we're brand new, so we are still open for conversations around that, and anything that supports Ngāi Tāhu. Yeah, I'm just looking at that.
Okay, cool.
It's a bit of a mix too. I think you've got kind of iwi, philanthropic and government, and the challenge is how to get over the short-term fix of a little project to go, really this is, I'd say, the first case where you've got a hapū that's trying to take the future of work seriously, and looking at that with a kind of 5-year plus time frame. So Jazz and Tanya have been great in securing some initial 3-year investment, which is really hard. But again, this isn't a flash in the pan. To go, well, we know what short-term little itty-bitty projects don't really change much. And to go, that key thing I think coming back to would just be, we have our youth population is doubling in size. So these are things like historical inequalities that we really need to get on top of, because we have an ageing Pākehā population moving into retirement and a younger, browner workforce coming through. It's going to be hitting at the same time where we're really transitioning from an old way of doing things to a new way. So the challenge is great, but to be proactive about it is much better than to be.
So then in that case, if you didn't know about it, if you want to write down the wellbeing budget 2020, you do know about it, yeah. Because I also noticed on there that there wasn't industries, the 2 industries that I'm interested in potentially having a chat about, and that was you were missing tourism for some reason. I know Ngāi Tāhu tourism is on the ground a little bit at the moment, but you were also missing aviation, and I wondered about that as well. So, yeah.
They're in the pipes.
They're in the pipes, yeah. Okay, cool.
Again, it's kind of not trying to exclude, but having a strategic focus around where we are. So if you think of tech, we're like less than 2% of the tech industry, when we talk about, probably most of us in this room, when we go to lockdown, we were okay because we have a laptop from work, we can work remotely. Majority of my cousins and nephews and nieces aren't in those situations. So we can bounce back and we're insulated, we've got to start to think around, well, how do we not keep channeling our people to the same places, which often underline it as a thing that Māori are good with their hands. And the subtext of that is, well, we're not too good with our heads. So how do we start to break down some of those barriers and then support Māori into, I mean, we've got plenty of hautatu, nephews and nieces, you know, to go, how do we support their creativity and their application of their genius into a range of areas, not just one or two.
So Maori, and you're already in aviation? Is that what you're saying? Like?
Oh, I'm just saying it's kind of getting that brief where most Māori are channeled into one or two sorts of areas.
Yeah.
Like front customer service tourism.
Kia ora, I'm Tracy from Te Community Housing Trust. So I'm working with people who are quite isolated in their homes, and I'm wondering about, totally love the presentation, just wondering about, talked a lot about young people, I'm just wondering about older, more isolated adults, if they might be involved.
So it's for all ages.
Yeah.
No discrimination around
Do you have an idea where you might be located once you have a base for people to go to?
in the city, so we're looking after Takiwā as well. In the city. Once we know, we'll tell you about it.
Probably just a good point, but around a mature Māori workforce, that's actually one of the biggest challenges. And they're going to have an increasing ageing generation to look after and an increasing younger generation. And they're the ones that are so busy, working that they cannot afford to. Yeah, the option of going out, exiting work and retraining for 3 years to get on the new wave is just not an option. So part of that big challenge is how do we kind of create training options and upskilling options that don't force people to step out of work full time, because for that kind of, all of my uncles and aunties, it's just not an option, but they can get trapped in an area which is on a decline. So how do we support them into those transitions of reskilling for the future?
Got one more question in count, I think.
Kia ora koutou, thanks for that. Really inspiring. Thanks for presenting. Might be something that needs a longer discussion another time. You talked about building Māori pathways into high-skilled jobs and Māori-led solutions. We know we're also in a predominantly park-out system. So when you're starting talking about more Māori health education, isn't there a risk of assimilation into that park-out system, or do you think we need to do some decolonisation in those systems before bringing Māori in, or is it a hand-and approach? What are the plans of happening on to do both?
I think those are the conversations that we've been having, for years now anyway. But when we've been talking to the different industry partners, they are on board. They know that change is happening and they know what they need to do as an organisation. So it is happening. Probably not as fast as we'd like, but there is change out there and they're on the same wavelength as us. I mean, this model is good for everybody. It's not just good for us. So.
Amazing. I think we've done a round of applause.